The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
I think we left off here. I talked about the 10% plan, Lincoln's assassination. Did I talk about Johnson in this class? How he was the only senator from Tennessee? Okay, so we got that far. Presidential Reconstruction. So Johnson would follow essentially Lincoln's plan, wanting to make Reconstruction short. And he wanted to end by the end of 1865. He said that all states must ratify the 13th Amendment, and then nearly all the citizens of the southern states that seceded from the Union would be allowed to have their citizenship by simply taking that oath that Lincoln had said. Remember, if you take an oath to the Union, then you would gain your citizenship, and if 10% had gotten their citizenship, states could write a constitution and apply for statehood. So Johnson is really very lenient. Congress is willing to go along with him because, of course, there's no plan for such an occurrence in the Constitution. There's only one stipulation that Johnson has. Certainly this is something that that Lincoln never talked about. And it's that planters, so the wealthiest Southern citizens worth $20,000 or more, as well as high-ranking ex-Confederates, so say political and military personnel, would have to personally apply to President Johnson for their citizenship. And that was mainly something that he did because he personally held a grudge against Southern planters. He had grown up extremely poor. He actually, it's said that he didn't go to school one day in his life. And so he has no formal education, which of course it's not terribly uncommon for that to happen at that time period. But nevertheless, he's not especially bright. He's terribly uneducated. And he hates the freedmen, so he's very much in line with the planters in that respect. He is very terribly prejudiced. He's really just the opposite of the type of person that the country needs as a leader at the time when we're just emerging from this horrible Civil War. So Congress and the North is definitely not happy with what they see happening in the South in the months after the war ends. For instance, the slave codes, which had governed the conduct of slaves in the South, as far as laws such as that they cannot get married legally, they cannot testify in court, they could not travel without a note from their master, things like that. They have just simply been reworked and are now known as the Black Codes. And they're quite restrictive. They say things like, if you cannot prove that you can support yourself or your family, you can be arrested, your family can be arrested and then forced to work on a plantation. And so essentially what Southern states are trying to do is reinvent slavery in everything but name. But initially, there's not a lot that Congress sees that it can do about dealing with the South. The Congress, at the end of the Civil War, did pass a measure to establish the first social welfare program in the history of the United States. And this is really important. It's called the Freedmen's Bureau. And again, it's the first social welfare program in the United States. And it was set up so that government officials would go into the South to help the former slaves, now known as freedmen, adjust to life as a person in a free society. They would establish schools and they would write work contracts. Actually, no work could take place on a plantation in the South when the war ended until the workers, the freedmen, actually worked out a contract with their former master. How much land would be plowed up and what would be grown on it, who would pay for what, and of course, since the planter had the money and the former slaves had no money or very little money, the planter would then pay for everything, and then the idea would be that at the end of the season when the crop came in, primarily cotton, it would be weighed and expenses would be accounted for from that cotton, and then the proceeds would be, of course, shared. This is the system of sharecropping that develops. It often was a system that was rampant with people were terribly dishonest. The former slaves were often ripped off, essentially, is what happened. They were cheated by their former masters and often left in a state of perpetual debt, known as peonage, work peonage, in which you worked but you never really made any money. And in many senses, it basically, what you see developing, although it ebbs and flows during Reconstruction, but eventually what will happen is you will see essentially slavery reemerge in everything but name. Although there is a period of great hope in the first 10 years of after the Civil War ends, actually the first 12 years. But after that, it really falls apart, which we'll get to. So the Freedmen's Bureau is this relief agency, first social welfare agency in the history of the United States. The schools it established are extremely important because the freedmen want to have an education. About 10% of the freedmen population actually did have some ability to read or write. And that's because the some slaveholders did break the law by teaching their slaves how to read and write, or at least some of them, because they believed that slavery would end at some point in the future, and they wanted them to be prepared. Now, 3,000 schools was terribly inadequate, though, to serve nearly 4 million people that needed an education. So they were only able to serve about 150,000 men, women, and children during the existence of the time of the Freedmen's Bureau. It only exists for about 7 years.
Was that due to lacking funds?
Well, it's really quite extraordinary that Congress would pay for anything like this to begin with, because at the time, there's a great belief in small government, limited government. It goes back to the Revolution and the founding of the country. So it's quite extraordinary that they did anything like this, but it was because of the really unusual circumstances that the country found itself in that Congress was willing to really make that leap and do something that had never been done before. But certainly because of a lack of funds, the federal government never had a very large budget historically. Their main source of income came from revenues of imports, so the import taxes, tariffs they're called, that come from foreign goods that come from foreign countries, and that was the main source of income, and the sale of land, because there was no income tax. I remember I talked the other day about how the income tax that was established at the time the war began was only temporary. Certainly there were charitable organizations that did churches set up schools. Certainly black churches that were formed in the South set up schools. And that's actually one of the things I have here on this list, is that the African American community insisted on setting up their own churches. They refused to worship with their former masters and their families in the local churches. And this sounds kind of weird, but one of the things I remember from some readings I did in graduate school was about how offended the white community was that their former slaves didn't want to worship with them anymore, which doesn't seem strange at all, but to me, but but the white community was definitely offended by a lot of things that went on once their slaves were freed. So the freedmen insist on a number of things while they're making these work contracts through the Freedmen's Bureau and their former masters, is that they refuse to work in gangs. So they would no longer work together in groups. They were going to farm their own individual plots of land in a family unit, just like poor white families did, and just like most free people in the North, of course, did as well. And they were also refused in that first year that their women would not work as well. And this is because of the perception within the African American community, of course, of what freedom was all about, is that the women stayed home because they generally only saw what the wealthy people did on the plantation, and they didn't see what the poor people did, because the poor women, in poor white families, the women always did work. Everyone had to contribute in order to survive, but what they mostly knew was what was going on the plantation. And on the plantation, of course, the wife managed the house and oversaw the raising of the children, and so they saw that this was something that they wanted for their families. Of course, in the end, it didn't prove practical, and it actually was a problem for Southern society in that first year, just because society was on the verge of starvation at the time. So not only did the cotton have to get planted so that there would be some type of a hard currency coming into the economy in the South once it was harvested, but people needed to be fed, because the food crops had not been planted in sufficient amounts in the previous at least year, if not 2 years, of the war, as the war spread throughout the southern states, and crops just were not planted. The slave community stopped working, fled to the Union lines whenever Union soldiers would get nearby. The word would spread throughout the communities, and the slaves would run to the Union lines, and then they would follow the Union troops throughout the course of the end of the war in order for them to be protected. So, and most importantly, for them to get their freedom. So this is what's going on in the first months after the war ends. The sharecropping system is now developing, taking form, as the freedmen drag their former slave quarters to the plot of land that they've negotiated that they would plant, and every family would certainly have been different. Some families, maybe larger families, would plow and plant more land, smaller families, smaller plots of ground. But what was quite common was that cotton, which in the Deep South was the main crop, was planted in huge amounts, and planted, actually, they said, right up to the doorstep. And actually this photograph here gives you a good idea of how much cotton. Not only are the fields surrounding the property, but literally almost right up to the front porch you have cotton being planted. That's not necessarily a good thing. Cotton was overplanted. And by overplanting cotton, it meant that there was a glut on the commodities market. And did anyone ever take a business class, either in high school or here in college? So you know about supply and demand. And so if there's too much of a supply, then there's not enough people or demand to buy it, and prices go down. And so that's what happens after the Civil War, not just for a short period, actually for decades, is the price of cotton is extremely low. Many of the major buyers for American cotton, such as the manufacturers in Liverpool and Manchester, Birmingham, in northern England, where they produced cotton cloth, they went elsewhere to buy cotton during those years of the Civil War, and they didn't return to buy as much cotton as they had previously because they found other places around the world to buy it, like Egypt, for instance, or probably India as well. So that's what's going on, which will affect the Southern economy. The Southern economy, of course, is in ruins in 1865. There was hyperinflation. As I said, there's a lack of food. And it never truly recovers. Certainly it recovers in pockets. You definitely see some northern textile manufacturers moving their operations to the Deep South in the years after the Civil War to be close to the cotton itself, so it didn't have to be shipped from the South all the way up north. It could now be, cloth could be produced directly in the South, but they also moved there because, not just to save the transportation costs, but because labor was so cheap in the South, and which meant that fabric overall in the United States increasingly became cheaper and cheaper throughout the 19th century. That was a good thing for the consumer, but actually for the people producing the cotton and producing the cloth, especially in the South, meant that their wages were lower than anywhere else. And overall, what you see is an economy that really doesn't recover. You really don't see a major recovery throughout the region until literally World War II, when the federal government begins to build large factories in order to fight the war effort in the South as well. So, and that created the Sun Belt. But that's about 70 years later, a very long time afterwards, almost 80 years later. So, and then one last thing about the Southern economy before I move on is that because you'll end up with a segregated society, eventually what you'll see is stipulations that at the time of Reconstruction that Southern states have to establish public schools, which didn't exist until after the war. And so that meant that there would be a need, obviously, for states to raise revenue and have some type of a tax. But taxes, of course, in states that really didn't believe in lots of government and lots of taxes, meant that taxes were never really sufficient. And then because you end up with white schools and black schools in a society that's run by racist white people, meant that the majority of the revenue from those taxes went to the white schools, and then a smaller amount to the black schools, which meant that all the children in Southern states tended to suffer in getting an education because none of those schools actually got enough funding. So that was a problem as well, which would haunt the South and often is the basis of bad jokes that still can be made today. Yeah.
There's a great I've ever heard of Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry.
What is it now?
Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. It's a
Oh,
novel.
yeah, I've never read it, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, I've read it before, and it gives a good explanation of what's going on during Reconstruction.
Yeah. So does some of this sound familiar? What I'm talking about? Yeah.
A little bit. It sounds familiar to me.
Good.
Because I've read it, and
yeah, I tend not to read historical fiction, but there are some good historical novels out there. But maybe when I retire, I'll have time. I just mostly read history right now. So let's move on. So that gives you an idea of what's going on in the society, and this is more about what's going on in society as well. So I mentioned the black churches. They were a great source of both spiritual and psychological support when they're founded, and certainly would continue even to this day to be a major part of the black communities. And they also ran schools. That's something that they offered. And remember, I said there's about 10% of the freedmen population that does have some type of an education. So it's certainly possible, because you do have people who do have an education that can be teachers within the black community. Even if they did have a limited education. And actually, in society as a whole, in the 19th century, the standards for being a teacher, especially in rural communities, was often not that great. So oftentimes, if as long as you could read and write and do some math, a lot of times you could get a job as a teacher, sad to say. But they basically had no standards for the most part in most communities. I had a whole class on the history of education at U of M, which is sort of a sorry state of affairs that the country found itself in for a long time. It's only really in the 20th century that they start to have more and more standards. They provided charitable services, and that's certainly important as well. So trying to help those in need, which certainly had to be difficult, especially when you consider it's a community that has very little money at the time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a community that has no money, because there were definitely, I don't know if I talked about it in this class, but there were ways during the slave period where slaves could make money by selling extra vegetables from the gardens if they had a skill, such as being carpenters on a plantation or iron workers. Sometimes they could be hired out by nearby plantations as well to do work for them and keep part of the revenue. It was always a custom that was done. So it doesn't mean that there's absolutely no money, but obviously very small amounts compared to, say, what the white community would have had. And then certainly by forming churches, the African American community could experience what it was like for self-government by electing trustees to the church board of trustees and forming committees. And so, in a small, it's kind of a small microcosm of like a larger society, but the political environment that goes on in larger society, because church, you're running the church government. You're overseeing the management of the daily affairs, constructing buildings, things like that. And that was seen as an important aspect of what a life as a free person was like. So some powerful Northerners who either came down to the South after the war ended or may have remained, officers or servicemen from the North who saw opportunities, often stayed and lived in the South. They often had a disproportionate amount of power, whether it be politically or economically. They may have gone into politics, run for office at local or state levels. They may have opened businesses. And these people were certainly looked down upon by the Southerners. And they were given this derogatory term known as carpetbaggers. So carpetbaggers were these powerful Northerners. And the term carpetbagger comes from a type of suitcase that's commonly used at the time. And it's simply a piece of wall-to-wall carpeting. It's an ingrain carpeting in the 19th century. It's very common. They were woven on jacquard looms in wide strips, and then they would be sewn together, and you could carpet just like we would have a wall-to-wall carpeting today, and it could carpet your floors. And what they would do is they would take a piece of this carpeting, and you could sew up the sides, and then put a handle on it, stick all your stuff in there. And so, Northerners are coming down to the South to live with their carpetbags, and they say, look at all these carpetbaggers coming here to take over our communities. And so they're not well liked. Probably the only time that you ever saw a carpetbag would have been if you ever saw Mary Poppins when you were a kid. It's that big bag that Mary Poppins carries with her. That's a carpetbag. So just after President Johnson says that Reconstruction has ended, he says it ends at the end of December 1865, the South had elected senators and congressmen, and they're arriving up in Washington in January of 1866 to take their oath and take their seats. But of course, because Congress is a separate branch of government, it doesn't have to do what the president says. So it says that, well, the president may say Reconstruction is over, but we are not happy with the people that have been elected to represent their states, because they are often the same people who had started the Civil War and had served in the Civil War either as politicians or in the military. Often high-ranking politicians or military officers were being elected, and Congress is greatly offended by this. And they say, we refuse to seat these people. And what Congress actually does as well as this is they start to say that we don't recognize that Reconstruction is over. President Johnson, though, of course, said it was, and because there's nothing in the Constitution and there's no law actually dealing with a process of Constitution, throughout 1866, Congress was unable to pass a law to take control of the Reconstruction process. But after the midterm election of November of 1866, and then finally once the new senators and congressmen have taken their oath in 1867, there's enough votes to override the president's veto early in 1867. And so what you see is that a new Reconstruction will start, known as Congressional Reconstruction, often referred to as well as Military Reconstruction. And it begins in March of 1867, and it will last for 10 years until April of 1877. So you have these two phases of Reconstruction. The short phase, in which was overseen by the president, and then the long phase in which the Congress takes control and says, no, what the president did was not to our liking, and we're going to start over again. And so that's what they do. They start over again. They throw the southern states out of the Union and say that you have to begin again. They divide the South into 5 military zones, except for Tennessee. Tennessee was the only state that Congress said had done everything favorably, and Congress was happy with it, and so they could remain in the Union, but the rest of the former Confederate states were now thrown out. I always find that quite incredible, that here we had the situation where we said you can't leave the Union, then they come back into the Union after a long war, then Congress says, well, we don't like what you've done, so now you're not in the Union again, and you're going to have to follow a bunch more of our rules, which would include passing the 14th Amendment to the Constitution as well. Establishing schools be another one of the criteria. And overall, most southern states, well, they did the bare minimum of what they had to do in order to get readmitted to the Union. Because what they wanted was, they wanted the military to stop occupying their states. Because what that meant was that they were under military rule, there would be martial law, and white Southerners would, well, many of them would drop out of politics altogether. But certainly many of them wanted to regain control. It's actually another term that's going to be coming up of their politics. And they were willing to do what they had to in order to get Reconstruction, at least in their state, to end. Even though Reconstruction as a whole continues, because some states just couldn't get it together enough for 10 years. Congress is increasingly displeased, to say the least, with President Johnson. And they're very worried that he's going to replace his cabinet, the cabinet that had been put in place by President Lincoln. And so they pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And this says that the president has to get congressional approval if he's going to fire high-ranking officials. Officials that would have had to been approved by the Senate confirmed by the Senate initially. But of course, historically, if you serve at the will of the president, you may have to get Senate approval, but then you can fire that person later on without Senate approval. This law changed everything. Congress was on recess in the summer of 1867, and the president fires the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And then that will lead to a crisis, which will, initially the president actually ascends to congressional wishes and says, okay, he can come back, he's not fired. But in the end, the president can't take it, and he's like, no, he's got to go. And so the guy's fired. Congress decides to investigate and see if the president has broken any laws, and this clearly, according to the Tenure of Office Act, he did not get Senate approval for the firing of the Secretary of War. So the House of Representatives says, yes, there's enough evidence to show that the president has broken the law and his oath of office, and which is vague. It basically says high crimes and misdemeanors is basically what Congress is looking at, the House of Representatives. So then they send it on to the Senate, because if you're impeached, that just simply means that the House of Representatives was investigating you. They believe that you broke the law, and but like anybody else, then you'll have to be tried. And for the President of the United States, unlike other people, what that means is that you have to be tried by the United States Senate. So they send it over to the Senate. The senators sit as the jury. The Chief Justice of the United States sits as the judge, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And in the end, Johnson was not convicted in the Senate. He survives being thrown out of office by one vote. So, but after that, he has less than a year to go in his term. And after that, he is essentially neutralized. He's often referred to in the newspapers as the dead dog of the White House. And so he's just waiting out the time until March of 1869, when he can leave office and go back to Tennessee. Years later, this law actually would be challenged, and it would be found to be unconstitutional. So the Tenure of Office Act was not legal, and Johnson would have been vindicated, but he didn't live to see that happen. It's several decades before it was struck down. So the election of 1868, Johnson clearly has no hope, no political hopes to win the election as president in his own right. Because remember, he's only serving out Lincoln's term of office. So he retires, and the hero of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant, former general, will run as the Republican from the state of Illinois. Grant, like Lincoln, was from Illinois. He'll run against the governor from New York State, Horatio Seymour. Seymour tried to capitalize on racial tensions in the North, and so he ran this racist campaign of fear. He spoke about stopping the spread of black political empowerment, but in the end, of course, Grant will win. In the South, white Southerners begin to terrorize African American communities in order to keep them from voting in the election. but they weren't able to stop all African American men from voting. So there were still 500,000 votes cast by African Americans in the Deep South, or throughout the South, in states that had fulfilled their requirements for Reconstruction. And that gave Grant enough votes in order to win the election. But if it hadn't been for the votes of the South, Seymour would have won. And there's the electoral map, how it worked out. Grant wins. The Republican Party clearly is a part of Southern politics now, at least while you have people like carpetbaggers in charge and Reconstruction going on and occupation of southern states. But you do have some Southerners who would vote with the Republican Party, and they were seen as being traitors to their race and to their communities. And they were given this derogatory term, scallywags. So just like carpetbaggers, who would have been Northern Republicans, these people, scallywags, are seen as probably being even worse because they're part of their own communities in the eyes of the white community, the white kind of racist viewpoint of the time, and you have them voting for Republican candidates. And so they're definitely hated, and they would have been ostracized if it came out that they knew that you were a scallywag, that you were voting for the Republican Party. And you have to realize that there's not necessarily a secret vote like we have today. And so it's very easy to tell which way people are voting because of the way that the ballots were at the time. They look different for each party. Was one of the ways that you could tell how people were voting. The whole issue of the vote is a big part of why Congress decides that we need another amendment to the Constitution, this time the 14th Amendment. The South, because they saw they had no choice, they do ratify the 13th Amendment, but they say, well, African Americans may be free, but they're not really citizens. Congress says yes, they are, and therefore the 14th Amendment is created, and the states will have to ratify that in order to come back into the Union. It grants citizenship to all people born in the United States. This is actually something that is quite unusual worldwide. The United States, unlike other countries around the world, is a country that says if you're born here, you're a citizen. Whereas historically, the law, say throughout Europe or really anywhere in the world, would not necessarily recognize that you're a citizen of that country if you're just simply born there. And so, and even to this day, that happens. It's only the United States, and it's because of the Civil War and because of the slavery that existed and this fight over citizenship during Reconstruction that led Congress to take this action in the 14th Amendment. So if you are born in this nation, no matter where your parents were from, you become automatically a citizen of this nation. You have all the protections under the law as anybody whose family has been here for 100 years or 200 years. And yet Southerners, even with the passage of the 14th Amendment, resisted giving African Americans the right to vote. So that would lead Congress in 1869 to write the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, saying that African Americans are not only born here and are citizens, have all the legal rights of citizens, including citizenship And that's what the 15th Amendment does. It says that all men have the right to vote. Because remember, in the 19th century, women do not yet have the right to vote. Giving women the right to vote was extremely controversial historically. Many people thought that it would ruin the family if women sullied themselves by going out into the man's world and had to deal with politics. That was often an excuse by the men of the time. So, white Southerners who would take any steps necessary in order to gain white control of the South, white Democratic control, Democrat meaning the Democratic Party, because historically the Democratic Party in the South was the party of what was seen as keeping the ways of the Old South, the ways of white rule that had ruled the Old South at the time of the Civil War. And so what people who said that we can do anything as long as we get back control, and that meant rape, murder, whatever it might be, they were known as redeemers. They would redeem the South from black Republican rule, is to use a term of the day. And so how do redeemers do that? Well, they do it with political corruption. Political corruption, of course, is rampant throughout the country in the 19th century anyway. It doesn't matter if you're in the South, you could be in the North, and there's all kinds of graft and political corruption going on. As I've said, white Southerners refused to give in to Northern pressure beyond the minimal amount needed to regain statehood, but that's about it. So they are passing whatever amendment Congress tells them to, because basically the idea was once Reconstruction ends, once the soldiers are gone, essentially then the white politicians saw that they could do whatever they wanted. That's the idea. And so part of this strategy of the Redeemers is through white resistance is by forming terrorist organizations. And of course, I'm sure that you've heard of the Ku Klux Klan, but there were many of them at the time. The White Brotherhood, the Knights of the White Camellia, the Knights of the Rising Sun were some of these organizations, which, by the way, tended to start like the Klan as a military veterans organization. Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former Confederate general, and John B. Gordon, another former Confederate general, founded a Confederate veterans organization called the Ku Klux Klan. But after a few meetings, they started to think, well, maybe we shouldn't just gather to talk about stuff. Maybe we should start doing stuff to regain control, political control of the South. And so that's what happens. And they come up with the idea that they want to keep their identities hidden, so they wear these costumes in order to do that. And they would terrorize anybody that they thought was their enemy. So certainly the people in the black community, to stop the black community from voting, but as well as the white community, those scallywags and the carpetbaggers certainly as well. They wanted to get people who were against what they thought society should look like to at least neutralize them. They did not want them to vote. Oftentimes they wanted them to leave their communities, especially the white people. So these became violent organizations that would subjugate the communities. And they used race to unify the white community, because historically the wealthy planter class looked down upon the white community. even though you may have been related to many of those people. Yeah.
That's ironic.
Yeah. But after the Civil War, they say in order to regain white control and political power, that they wanted all people within the white community to unite against African Americans, because really African Americans, poor African Americans, which was pretty much most of the community, and most of the white community, of course, was poor as well, just eking out a living off the land. They had actually more in common, and the wealthy white planters didn't want to see the whites and the blacks unite. So what they do is they use this idea of race, that all white people have to stand together, and they unfortunately were quite successful at doing that. The Klan and these other organizations will get out of control by 1870 and 71, especially in South Carolina and Texas. And so the federal government and the Republican-led governments in these states were actually quite responsive about cracking down initially when you start to have violence. And you see large numbers of arrests. For instance, in Texas, 6,000 members of the Klan are rounded up and arrested between 1870 and 1872. Congress passes a law that outlaws armed groups that deny civil rights or political rights. And in South Carolina, President Grant suspends the writ of habeas corpus, and which leads to 2,000 people fleeing the state and many being arrested. And so for many years after the war, even though the South, white Southerners are really adamant about being miserable in order to try to regain control, there is a lot of response. The Northern public is quite happy to see what the federal government is doing and state governments are doing in the South that are run by Republicans. Even though I should point out that white Northerners were historically, as a whole, not individually, because there's a lot of people known as like radical Republicans who would have believed in racial equality, but there's even more people. It's more common for often the white community in the North to be rather racist as well. And whites in the North tended to favor racial equality as long as it existed in the South, but not necessarily in the North. If black people started moving into the North, then they really weren't too much in favor of that. And there was a small African-American community that always existed in the North, historically, a few 100,000 people. But of course, the majority of those that were of African descent lived in the South. And so I just want you to be aware of that, you know, kind of situation that occurred. The Klan was, of course, temporarily broken, and but not permanently. And that's there's a variety of reasons for that. President Grant was getting a lot of bad publicity, and the bad publicity came about because there was a lot of political corruption going on within his administration, not by the president personally. Ulysses Grant was a very honest and decent man personally, but he often had bad judgment when giving out political jobs or appointing people to certain offices, and that proved to be a problem for him as people were involved in illegal activities who were friends of his. And so that leads President Grant to take a more conservative approach to Reconstruction. He supports the Amnesty Act, which pardoned most former Confederate leaders. So the few people who were not given their citizenship at the end of the war. For the most part, everybody, when this law was passed, with the rare exception of, for instance, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, who never does regain his citizenship. But for the most part, most high-ranking Confederate officials would be given their citizenship back with the passage of this measure. This Grant sees as a way to kind of get some good publicity, especially in the South, and try to smooth things over so that the newspapers aren't full of all the scandals that are swirling around him. And he's able to win re-election in 1872 when he runs against Horace Greeley from New York. And as I mentioned, of course, there was the crackdown of the Ku Klux Klan, which did allow for more African Americans to vote in the election of 1872, and helps give Grant the win. Greeley was not as terrible as Horatio Seymour, but he's calling for reconciliation between North and South. And many Northerners in 1872 really aren't feeling all that friendly towards the South yet. And so that works against Greeley.
Well, then
Actually, Greeley...
Well, then again, they did attack a federal board.
There was a lot of, definitely there was violence, but you know, the federal government has great power and within the military. That's why the South lost. The South could not hold out in a war of attrition, a war that would continue and continue. And so Southerners may have at times been violent, like with the Klan, but they could never stand up to the federal government when the federal government had the will to fight against them, to actually do something. The problem as time goes on is federal will and Northern support will begin to wane as the years continue, is the problem. So people begin to tire of it all. You know, by the time you get to, say, 1873, 1874, now it's over 10 years since the Civil War has started. And yet, you still have all this controversy going on with the South. And that will eventually lead to public apathy. The public just really, really tires of the whole situation. And that's the problem. Horace Greeley, by the way, dies shortly before the election day, inauguration day. So had he won, it would have created a crisis in that there was actually no person to be inaugurated. And then what would happen? So here's Horace Greeley. Here's the map, Grant winning. And then another reason why you would see support for Reconstruction begin to wane as the 1870s progress is that the economy collapses. It's called the Panic of 1873. So economic decline in the 19th century. It was not common to use a term like recession or depression. They were referred to as panics. It's not that they were any different. It's just the term of the time. You have this economic downturn in which businesses collapse, banks fail, and people are thrown out of work in large numbers, and therefore people are distracted because, of course, they're personally affected now that they don't have a job, they don't know how they're going to pay their bills, feed their children, things like that.
Was this as bad as the Great Depression of the 1920s?
No, there was never, ever a economic downturn that was as bad as the Great Depression of the 1920s. There was one that came close in the 1890s, the Panic of 1893, but never one. The country has never seen one as bad. So, as I've been saying, there's all these reasons, and so I've listed them here for you. feel free to write them down or take a picture of it. But just Northerners tire Southern resistance. There's corruption in the Grant administration. Some people, I didn't mention this, see that Reconstruction should come to an end, and they tire of it because they say that the goals of Reconstruction have ended. You know, the Civil War was fought and slavery is ended. Southern states have been brought back into the Union. Laws have been passed in Southern states creating public education. And so they say that, you know, the North has done what it needs to do. Schools were established initially under the Freedmen's Bureau. So we need to move on and allow the South to go carry on its daily business. And that's how many people felt too. Just let's be rid of them. You know, even if you didn't think all the goals were accomplished, many people were just like, it's the same old story. Before the war, the South was always whining and complaining that the North is oppressing them. And here you have a years and years and years after the war in which the North is trying to force things on the white South to do, and they're not happy about it. So many people just want to go on their way and say, just let them deal with their problems, and we'll deal with our problems up here in the North. So. And so political strife, government corruption, and there was certainly mismanagement of Reconstruction as well. Everything did not go perfectly. So many people say, let's just move on.
Wait, were there, if Lincoln had not been assassinated, would things have gone a lot smoother, or there would still be a lot of...
Well, we can always speculate. You know, in some sense, when Lincoln is assassinated, I mean, he really secures his reputation, because who knows how he would have dealt with the problems over the next 4 years of his term. And, you know, history certainly could have been much different, but we'll never know, you know. So it's interesting to think about. I tend to think that obviously it would have been way better than Johnson, who was this white Southern Democrat racist who oversaw the first 4 years, or at least the first year, and then congressional Reconstruction starts. So what will bring about the end of Reconstruction? Well, it's due to the election of 1876. The governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, as well as a veteran of the Civil War, and the governor of New York, this time Samuel Tilden, as the Democrat, will face off. And in this case, the election is really, really close. Tilden wins the popular vote, but he's one vote shy in the Electoral College. Part of the crisis and the vote being close is that there's actually a dispute over some ballot boxes, ballots that come from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. And so one thing that I haven't mentioned yet about Reconstruction is that you find shadow governments, state governments emerging. For instance, in South Carolina, while there may have been an officially recognized government, there was also a shadow government established by a former governor of South Carolina who had his own cabinet, and they had their own legislature. And so, so then you have the African American community and the scallywags that recognize the official government, and then you have the rest of the white population that was recognizing the shadow government. And so, so what you're getting in cases like this is a lot of ballot boxes showing up to be counted. And then the question is, what votes are actually the legal votes? And so that was part of the problem that created this crisis in the election of 1876. Having no clear winner Congress decides that they will establish a committee to try to decide who is actually the winner. And it was supposed to be, well, at least for the public record, it was supposed to be divided between equal numbers of Democrats, Republicans, with one independent. But in the end, the independent miraculously decided that he would resign. And so Congress appoints a Republican, meaning that the Republicans have control of the committee. You have more votes. So it's already a set deal of who's going to be the winner. Rutherford B. Hayes, even though he is not close in the Electoral College, is going to be a winner. The question is how to convince the Southern members of the committee and then the South as a whole to go along with this. And so it actually takes months to work out an agreement. So remember, the election is in November. In those days, though, the inauguration is not till the beginning of March, the 4th of March. So January, December, January, February. Finally, a few days before the inauguration date, the committee comes to an agreement. And it's a secret agreement at the time. It's known as the Compromise of 1877. On March the 2nd, 2 days before Inauguration Day, nobody really knew who the President of the United States was going to be until 2 days before. So, and the compromise says that Reconstruction will end. Federal troops that still remain in some occupied areas of the South, like Louisiana and South Carolina and Florida, will be removed. Congress says that they will invest in the Southern economy. And part of that will be to build a southern route of the Transcontinental Railroad. So, I mean, investing in the southern economy at a time when Congress doesn't have a lot of money and doesn't really believe in using federal funds for such things. Does that really happen? Well, I guess you can say they did build the southern route of the Transcontinental Railroad, so you could say yes, that's completed. Yeah.
I mean, just looking at the dates, and this is 1 day before my sister's birthday.
Okay.
She was born on March.
Hopefully not in 1877.
This is, I find this a strange coincidence.
Oh, well, not really. There's only 365 days of the year, so. Here's the electoral map showing how that worked out. And in the end, now, even though I've had a lot of bad things to say about Reconstruction and how Southerners dragged their feet and a lot of terrible things that happened, there really was progress that was made in those 10 years. And so I think first and foremost, you should come away with a sense that there had been progress and that African Americans really did gain a great deal of civil rights as a whole throughout the South, but only for those 10 years. Basically what happens, as long as there was federal troops in places and as long as the federal government was willing to send troops or state governments were willing to send the state police in to put down uprisings, which did happen, African Americans did vote and did participate in society, did send congressmen to Washington as well. But what happens when Reconstruction ends? Then that will all change. You'll stop seeing African Americans being elected to public office, both state and to the local, state, and federal positions, once the Redeemers gain control of their towns, of their counties, of their states. And it doesn't happen immediately. So just to say, well, Reconstruction ends officially in April of 1877, doesn't mean that automatically every single black person throughout the South lost their civil rights. What happens, though, is over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, by town, by township, by county, and then as a state as a whole, African Americans did lose their civil rights as white Southerners regained control throughout the entire former Confederacy. And then the federal government, the Northern public, had no stomach for dealing with that. They just let the South do what they wanted. And it would not be until finally, after World War II, African American men come home from fighting in Europe and in Asia, were often treated better by the indigenous populations in foreign countries than they were by their own citizens here at home, will no longer put up with that. And then you see the beginnings of the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. So, and for those poor black people who lived in the rural South, they often had no recourse. They are often watched by the white community. Their every move, the grandfather clause, the literacy test, the poll tax take hold throughout those states in which you are, depending on the community, some communities said that if you could pay a tax, it was often maybe $1 or $2, then you could vote. And that meant went for both the white population and the black population. It was a way to stop poor people from voting. It was a way to stop scallywags from voting if they didn't have the money to pay. Often communities or states, however the laws were written, depending on where it would govern, but it said that if you didn't pay your poll tax this year, obviously you couldn't vote, but if you want to vote next year, then you not only have to pay that poll tax, but you have to pay the previous poll taxes that you didn't pay. So then obviously after time, if you couldn't afford the $2, how are you going to afford the $4 or the $8 or whatever it's going to add up to over the years? So that was one way. The literacy test, all kinds of terrible ways that was done. It could mean reading a passage of Shakespeare and interpreting it. It could mean that they would give you something written in old medieval German script that even well-educated people could not read. It could mean showing you a jar of marbles and say how many are in that jar, and then of course nobody would know the answer, and so just hang on. And then finally the grandfather clause was a way that you would specifically then target because the first two. That was ways that communities could get the poor white population to stop voting, which they often wanted them to do as well. Or if they knew that you were going to vote the way they wanted you to, then they wouldn't require you, say, to take the literacy test. The grandfather clause said that if your grandfather voted before a certain date, like 1860, then you could vote. But of course, in the South, the idea was that only white people voted prior to the Civil War, and therefore, if you weren't white, your grandfather didn't vote. I have issues with that because, of course, with all the horrible brutality and rape that went on the plantations, clearly a lot of people's grandfathers were white and had voted. But nevertheless, that's not considered at the time. So essentially what you have is that you have nearly a century that the African American community does not vote. Really from the late 1870s when Reconstruction ends, or definitely by the late 1880s when essentially the whole Jim Crow racial segregated society completely is put in place, until the 1960s when you have campaigns to get African Americans to vote. So yeah.
So they were required to read German, like when translated. And
no, because it's the same Latin script, and so it's the same letters. But in medieval writings, it was often extremely elaborate, like you might see in very ancient writings. And so it's not the type of lettering that we would be familiar with nowadays. I mean, in the 19th century, lettering was the same as we would be used to. So it was just a way. It was just a weird, sneaky way of doing things. They would just come up with a bunch of weird, sneaky ways to do things in order to stop African Americans from voting.
I find it
So.
also hard that a well-educated person couldn't even understand it.
Right. Not many people could understand it. Violence, intimidation, and lynching became common in this period as well. So you see the Klan. Eventually, though, the Klan, for the most part, starts to die out after this. Once racial segregation is put in place, the Jim Crow system, certainly it would emerge if communities felt that they had to, but overall, what happened is that people were intimidated, and then of course you would have mob rule, where mobs would come out and accuse innocent people, very common, accuse innocent people of perpetrating a crime. And you see that happening well into the 20th century, where they would have lynchings, where people would be publicly hanged, never given a trial. Public burnings as well occurred. Now I'm not sure if the edition that you're going to get has that, but there's actually a photograph in one of our editions of the history books that would show that. You know, well-dressed people all standing around looking like they're having a party, and hanging somebody or burning somebody. It was horrendous. And it was acts like this in these communities that, as you can imagine, terrified the black community into submission, just trying to get by, raise their families, you know, leaving voting to the white people. You know, wasn't worth your life to vote. And since the federal government was not going to back you up, what recourse did you have? And you might say, well, you could leave. And that's actually a term that's going to be in the next chapter that I'll talk about in a couple days. Well, the problem is, if you have no money, if you live in a community where all the white people keep track of your every move, how are you going to leave if you have a wife and a bunch of kids? Maybe you could save up enough over years and years and years and buy a train ticket, but what are you going to do when you go to the train station? Everybody knows you. Who's going to work in the train station? White people. They're going to say, don't you work on Joe's plantation? Why are you buying these tickets? I'm calling Joe. I'm going to go down and see what Joe says about this. You know, they're going to say, you can't leave. Or are you going to run away? Which, of course, people did, obviously, in slave times. But you're living in the rural South, hundreds of miles away from, or thousands, depending on where you are, a long distance from the north. Are you going to run away with your wife and your little kids through the forests? And, that was an issue that families dealt with during slave times. It was not practical for most people to actually do. And so these are the realities of life for the freedmen in those decades. So it was extremely difficult for them. And really, the nation as a whole let them down because there was real progress in those first 10 years. But it was what happened after that the black community was ignored. And so that's the real shame of what happened. Yeah.
I've heard of lynching, but I've never heard of people being burned.
Oh yeah, and it's in our book, unfortunately. So, and it was not just happening in the South. You see it happening in places as far north as Illinois in the in the early part of the 20th century even. There were lynchings going on in some areas of border states even. So, all right, so we're actually done. So anyway, enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you on Thursday.
Good luck with today's lesson.